Every day when I wake up, feels like I'm really living a nightmare.
What if I told you that 2 children could vanish from their own home in broad daylight, leaving behind no footprints, no clothing, no toys, and no trace that they ever existed? What if I told you that despite one of the largest search operations in Canadian history, involving 160 trained professionals, helicopters, drones, and tracking dogs, not a single piece of evidence was ever found? And what if I told you that the people who claimed to love these children most were the last ones to see them alive? This isn't a story about children who got lost in the woods. This is the story of 6-year-old Lilly Sullivan and her 4-year-old brother Jack, who disappeared so completely that it defies explanation. Their case has baffled investigators, divided communities, and raised questions that strike at the heart of how we protect our most vulnerable. If you're drawn to cases that challenge everything we think we know about missing persons investigations, you're going to want to stick around for this one. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because we dive deep into cases that others won't touch. And this story is going to leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about family, trust, and the systems meant to protect children. The morning of May 2nd, 2025, started like any other in the remote community of Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. The sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees surrounding a weathered white trailer on Gearlock Road. Inside, 27-year-old Malaya Brooks Murray claimed she woke to the familiar sounds of her children playing in the next room. Lilly, 6 years old with bright eyes and a spirited personality, and Jack, 4 years old and full of energy, were supposedly starting another day in their isolated home. But by 10 a.m., everything had changed forever. The 911 call came in at exactly 10 a.m. Malaya's voice, surprisingly calm for a mother reporting missing children, informed the operator that her 2 children had vanished from their home. She explained that she had heard them playing around 8 a.m., but when the house fell silent between 8 o'clock and 8:20, she discovered they were gone. Think about that timeline for a moment. If you were a parent and realized your children were missing, how long would it take you to call for help? Minutes? Maybe 10 or 15 minutes after searching the immediate area. But Malaya and her partner, 33-year-old Daniel Martel, waited an hour and a half before contacting emergency services. An hour and a half of precious time that could have made the difference between finding children who had wandered off and, well, what we're left with now. When pressed about this delay, their explanations were vague and contradictory. They claimed they had searched the house and nearby woods, but neighbors would later question whether they had seen any signs of an active search during those critical 90 minutes. The couple appeared composed, almost eerily calm, as they described the morning's events to first responders. Within hours, the quiet home on Gearlock Road became the epicenter of one of the most intensive and puzzling searches in recent Canadian history. But what should have been a straightforward missing persons case quickly revealed itself to be something far more complex and disturbing. The initial response was swift and comprehensive. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived within minutes of the 911 call, and by that afternoon, a full-scale search operation was underway. The surrounding forests, thick with undergrowth and still scarred from Hurricane Fiona's devastation the previous year, would soon be crawling with trained professionals, volunteers, and sophisticated equipment. But even as the search teams organized and the helicopters took to the skies, something felt wrong. Experienced searchers noticed it immediately, the complete absence of any sign that children had ever been in these woods. No disturbed vegetation, no small footprints in the soft earth, no fabric caught on branches. It was as if Lilly and Jack had simply evaporated into the morning air. Daniel Martel, the children's stepfather, provided detailed descriptions of what the children were wearing when they supposedly disappeared. He described Lilly's outfit with remarkable specificity, a pink shirt and a distinctive white backpack decorated with red strawberries. He also mentioned Jack's blue boots adorned with dinosaur designs. These details would become crucial to the search effort, as teams combed the forest looking for any flash of pink, any sign of that distinctive backpack. But here's where the story takes its first truly unsettling turn. When investigators pressed Daniel for more details about that morning, he admitted something that would become a cornerstone of their suspicion. He had never actually seen Jack that morning. Not once. He had described in detail the clothing of a child he claimed never to have laid eyes on. When confronted with this contradiction, Daniel's explanation was that he had simply assumed what Jack might be wearing based on his usual preferences. How does someone describe the exact clothing of a child they never saw? How does a parent figure in a missing persons case provide crucial evidence about something they never witnessed? These questions would haunt the investigation from its very first hours. The search operation was like nothing the small community had ever seen. More than 160 trained professionals were deployed each day, creating a precise GPS grid that covered over 5 square kilometers of dense woodland. The terrain was unforgiving. Fallen trees from Hurricane Fiona created natural barriers, heavy underbrush made visibility nearly impossible, and recent rainfall had turned many paths into treacherous muddy tracks. Amy Hansen, a certified search and rescue leader with years of experience, coordinated the ground operations. She would later describe the search as one of the most thorough she had ever supervised. Every possible hiding spot, every depression in the ground, every cluster of fallen logs was systematically examined. Thermal imaging drones swept overhead, their sophisticated sensors searching for any sign of heat signatures that might indicate the presence of the missing children. But the technology that should have been their salvation revealed only the forest's secrets, wildlife, but no trace of Lilly and Jack. The silence from the search team's radios became increasingly ominous as hours turned into days without a single significant discovery. The community response was immediate and heartfelt. Neighbors who barely knew the family joined the search efforts, walking the difficult terrain for hours in hopes of finding any sign of the missing children. Local businesses donated supplies, and volunteers provided food and support for the search teams. The outpouring of community support was remarkable, especially considering how isolated the family had been. But as the search continued with no results, a different kind of tension began to build. Whispered conversations among volunteers and searchers revealed a growing unease. Something about this case didn't feel right, and the people who knew these forests best were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. The children's last confirmed sighting had been days earlier, not hours. The timeline provided by their caregivers was riddled with inconsistencies. And most troubling of all, the massive search operation was revealing a level of absence that defied explanation. In most missing persons cases, even under the most difficult circumstances, some evidence emerges. A torn piece of clothing, a footprint, something that confirms the person had been in the area. But Lilly and Jack Sullivan seemed to have vanished not just from their home, but from existence itself. And as the hours ticked by without answers, the focus of the investigation began to shift from the forest to the people who had last seen them alive. The stage was set for a case that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about missing children, family dynamics, and the very nature of truth itself. What happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan? The answer to that question would prove more elusive and more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. To understand what happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan, we need to go back to the last time anyone outside their household can definitively say they saw them alive. That day was Tuesday, April 29, 2025, and it was supposed to be just another ordinary school day in their young lives. Brian Ward had been driving the school bus route through rural Nova Scotia for over a decade. He knew every child on his route, their personalities, their habits, and their little quirks. When he speaks about Lilly and Jack Sullivan, his voice carries the weight of someone who realizes he may have been the last person outside their family to see them alive. Lilly was always the spirited one. Brian would later tell investigators. She'd bounce up those bus steps with energy that could light up the whole bus. Always had something to say, always excited about something. Jack was quieter, but he had this playful energy about him. He'd follow his sister's lead, but you could see he was processing everything, taking it all in. On that Tuesday morning, Brian dropped the children off at the end of their long, winding driveway on Gearlock Road. It was a routine he'd performed dozens of times before. The driveway stretched about 200 meters through dense woods before reaching the family's trailer, invisible from the main road. He watched, as he always did, until the children disappeared around the bend in the driveway, their small figures swallowed by the shadows of the towering trees. That image, Two children walking hand in hand down a wooded path toward home would be the last confirmed sighting of Lilly and Jack Sullivan by anyone outside their household. It was 3:45 p.m. on April 29, 2025, and from that moment forward, the children existed only in the accounts of the adults who lived with them. The significance of this timeline cannot be overstated. While their disappearance was reported on Friday, May 2nd, the last independent verification of their existence was 3 days earlier. 3 days is an eternity in a missing persons case, and it meant that the critical 72-hour window that investigators rely on had already passed before anyone realized the children were gone. Salt Springs Elementary School, where both children were enrolled, was a small rural institution with fewer than 90 students. In a school that size, every child matters and every absence is noticed. The staff knew Lilly and Jack, and they had been adjusting well to their new environment. Teachers described them as sometimes quiet but socially appropriate, contradicting later claims about developmental concerns. Wednesday, April 30th, was a scheduled professional development day. No classes were held, which meant the children wouldn't be expected at school. This detail, which might seem insignificant, actually provided the perfect cover for what was about to unfold. There would be no concerned teachers, no worried school administrators, no automatic check-ins that might have revealed something was wrong. Thursday, May 1st, was when the story begins to fracture. According to Malaya Brooks Murray, both children were kept home from school that day because Lilly had developed a cough. It was presented as a precautionary measure, the kind of responsible parenting decision that no one would question. But investigators would later note that there was no documented contact with a physician, no pharmacy records of cough medicine purchases, and no independent verification of any illness. Think about your own childhood, or if you have children, think about their daily routines. How many people might see them on any given day? Neighbors, mail carriers, store clerks, other parents, teachers, friends. Children leave traces of their existence everywhere they go. But after Tuesday, April 29th, Lilly and Jack Sullivan left no traces at all. The family lived in profound isolation on Gearlock Road. Their nearest neighbors were hundreds of meters away through dense forest. There was no cell phone service in the area, no internet connection, and no regular visitors to the household. The isolation that might have once provided privacy and peace had become something more sinister, a place where children could disappear from the world without anyone noticing. Daniel Martell worked at a local lumber mill, but according to his own statements, he only worked 1 day per week. How a family of 5 survived on such limited income was never clearly explained. There were no confirmed government benefits, no detailed explanation of their financial situation, and no clear picture of how they managed their day-to-day existence. This isolation extended beyond the physical. Malaya, a member of the Siknakatik First Nation, had distanced herself from her Indigenous community when she moved in with Daniel. She had left behind her extended family, her cultural connections, and the support structures that might have provided additional oversight and protection for her children. The property itself painted a picture of a family struggling to maintain their circumstances. The main trailer where the family lived was modest, with children's drawings taped to the walls and toys scattered in the yard. But searchers and neighbors also noted signs of neglect, rusting debris, cluttered conditions, and multiple animals living in cramped spaces. Just a few feet from the main trailer sat a second dwelling where Daniel's mother lived. This proximity meant that there were technically other adults nearby, but investigators would learn that there was little interaction between the households. The grandmother, who might have provided an additional layer of protection and oversight for the children, was not actively involved in their daily lives. The school bus route that Brian Ward drove every day became a lifeline of sorts for Lilly and Jack. It was their connection to the outside world, their daily interaction with people beyond their immediate household. The bus driver became their witness, their proof of existence in a world that was increasingly isolated and controlled. But even that lifeline was fragile. The bus stop was at the end of their driveway, not at their door. Once the children walked down that wooded path, they were invisible to the outside world. What happened in those 200 meters between the road and their home was known only to the people who lived there. The last Tuesday of their lives, April 29, 2025, was remarkable only in its ordinariness. Lilly and Jack woke up, got ready for school, rode the bus with their classmates, spent their day learning and playing, and returned home to what should have been safety and love. They had no way of knowing that they were walking into a situation that would make them disappear from the world forever. The bus driver's memory of that final drop-off would haunt him for months afterward. He replayed the scene over and over, wondering if there had been any signs he missed, any indication that something was wrong. But there was nothing. Just two children walking home from school, disappearing into the woods like they had done so many times before. As investigators would later piece together, the timeline of the children's disappearance was far more complex than initially reported. The gap between their last confirmed sighting and their reported disappearance was not a matter of hours, but days. And in those missing days, something happened that would erase Lilly and Jack Sullivan from existence so completely that even the most intensive search operation in the region's history would find no trace of them. The last Tuesday was the end of their story as far as the outside world was concerned. Everything that came after existed only in the accounts of the people who claimed to love them most, and those accounts were about to reveal themselves as something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The period between Tuesday, April 29th, and Friday, May 2nd, would later be described by investigators as the Silent Days, 72 hours during which two children supposedly lived, breathed, and existed in their family home, yet left no verifiable trace of their presence in the world beyond the walls of that isolated trailer. These weren't just any 72 hours. These were the last 72 hours of their lives as far as anyone outside their household could confirm. And the more investigators examined these days, the more disturbing the silence became. Wednesday, April 30th, was the professional development day when no classes were held at Salt Springs Elementary. This was a known scheduled event, meaning that the absence of Lilly and Jack from school would raise no immediate concerns. No teacher would mark them absent, no administrator would call to check on them, and no automated system would flag their non-attendance. But it was also the first day in what would become a pattern of increasing isolation. While other children in their class might have spent the day with friends, at community programs, or running errands with their parents, Lilly and Jack were allegedly confined to their trailer home with no contact with the outside world. Malaya Brooks Murray would later claim that both children were kept home on Thursday, May 1st, because Lilly had developed a cough. This explanation, on its surface, seemed reasonable. Responsible parents keep sick children home from school to prevent spreading illness and to allow for recovery. But investigators found no evidence to support this claim. There were no pharmacy records showing purchases of cough medicine, children's acetaminophen, or any other remedies that parents typically buy for sick children. No doctor's visits, no calls to health lines, no prescription medications. In an era where even minor childhood illnesses often generate some form of documentation, the alleged sickness of Lilly Sullivan left no paper trail whatsoever. More troubling still, there were no witnesses to support the claim that the children were home and sick. No neighbors reported seeing them in the yard. No delivery drivers encountered them. No casual visitors or relatives stopped by to check on them. The family's isolation, which might have once provided privacy, now provided perfect cover for something far more sinister. Daniel Martel's work schedule added another layer of complexity to the timeline. He claimed to work only one day per week at the local lumber mill, but his exact schedule during these crucial days was never clearly established. Was he home during the day? Was he at work? His accounts of his whereabouts were as inconsistent as his other statements about these critical 72 hours. The financial situation of the family also raised questions about their daily routines. With Daniel working only one day per week and no other confirmed source of income, how did they manage basic expenses? Were they making trips to grocery stores, gas stations, or other businesses where the children might have been seen? The absence of any financial records or receipts from these days suggested an unusual level of isolation from normal commercial activity. Think about the daily patterns of a typical family with young children. There are usually traces everywhere: grocery shopping trips where children might be seen, visits to relatives, playground visits, even just playing in the yard where neighbors might notice them. But during these silent days, Lilly and Jack Sullivan left no such traces. The family's technology usage during this period also came under scrutiny. In an age where even isolated families typically have some form of digital footprint, the absence of any electronic evidence of the children's presence was striking. No social media posts featuring them, no cell phone photos, no digital activity that would confirm their existence during these crucial days. Investigators would later examine the family's phones and digital devices, looking for any evidence of the children's presence during the silent days. What they found, or more accurately, what they didn't find, would add another disturbing layer to the case. The weather during these days was typical for late spring in Nova Scotia, cool but not cold, with intermittent rain showers. The kind of weather where children might be kept indoors more than usual, but not so severe as to explain complete isolation. Other families in the area were going about their normal routines, making the Sullivan family's complete disappearance from community life all the more notable. Local businesses in the area, from grocery stores to gas stations, were later canvassed by investigators looking for any sign that the family had been out and about during these days. Security cameras were reviewed, receipt records were examined, and employees were interviewed. The result was the same everywhere. No confirmed sightings of the family or the children during the crucial 72-hour period. The significance of these silent days cannot be overstated. In missing persons cases, the timeline is everything. The longer the gap between when a person was last seen and when they're reported missing, the more difficult the investigation becomes. But in this case, the gap wasn't just problematic, it was potentially catastrophic. If something had happened to Lilly and Jack on Wednesday or Thursday, the trail would have been cold by the time they were reported missing on Friday. Evidence would have been compromised, witnesses' memories would have faded, and the critical first hours of a missing persons investigation would have been lost forever. The silent days also revealed something troubling about the family's relationship with their community. In small rural communities, people typically know their neighbors, check on each other, and notice when something seems off. But the Sullivan family had become so isolated that they could go days without any external contact without raising concern. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was the result of a series of choices and circumstances that had gradually cut the family off from the support networks that might have protected the children. Malaya's distance from her Indigenous community, the family's remote location, Daniel's limited work schedule, and their lack of regular social connections had created a perfect storm of isolation. As investigators would later piece together, the silent days were characterized not just by the absence of the children from public view, but by a complete absence of any normal family activity. There were no trips to stores, no visits from friends or relatives, no interactions with neighbors, and no engagement with the broader community. The children who had been vibrant, visible, and engaged with the world on Tuesday, April 29th, had somehow become invisible by Wednesday, April 30th. They had entered a period of complete isolation that would last until they were reported missing on Friday, May 2nd. But were they really isolated, or were they already gone? This question would become central to the investigation, as investigators tried to determine whether the silent days represented a family dealing with sick children in isolation, or something far more sinister. The evidence, or lack thereof, was starting to paint a disturbing picture. The silent days weren't just a gap in the timeline, they were a chasm that swallowed two children so completely that it would take one of the largest search operations in Canadian history to try to find them. And as investigators would soon discover, the silent days were just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about missing children, family dynamics, and the very nature of truth itself. Friday, May 2nd, 2025, dawned gray and overcast in Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. The morning air carried the scent of pine and the dampness of recent rain, typical for late spring in the Maritime provinces. Inside the white trailer on Gearlock Road, what would later be described as the most critical morning in the Sullivan family's lives was about to unfold. According to Malaya Brooks Murray, she woke up sometime around 8 a.m. to the familiar sounds of her children playing in the next room. This detail, which might seem mundane in any other context, would become one of the most scrutinized elements of the entire investigation. What exactly did she hear? Were these the sounds of two children playing together, or something else entirely? Malaya's account of the morning was remarkably specific for someone who had just woken up. She described hearing the distinctive voices of both Lilly and Jack, their laughter, the sounds of movement and play that any parent would recognize. But investigators would later note that these details became vaguer and more contradictory each time she recounted them. The layout of the trailer was simple and small. The children's bedroom was adjacent to the master bedroom, separated by a thin wall that would easily allow sounds to travel between rooms. If children were playing, talking, or moving around, the sounds would be clearly audible to anyone awake in the neighboring room. But here's where the story begins to fracture in ways that would haunt investigators for months. Malaya claimed that sometime between 8 a.m. and 8:20 a.m., the house fell silent. The transition from the sounds of active children to complete quiet was, according to her account, sudden and noticeable. Think about that timeline. 20 minutes of confirmed sounds, then silence. In a normal household, this might prompt a parent to check on their children immediately. Were they hurt? Had they fallen asleep? Were they getting into something they shouldn't? But according to Malaya's account, she didn't investigate the silence right away. Instead, she claimed she remained in bed for an unspecified period after noticing the quiet. When pressed by investigators about how long she waited before checking on the children, her answers were inconsistent and evasive. Sometimes she said it was minutes, other times she suggested it might have been longer. Daniel Martel's account of the morning added another layer of complexity and contradiction. He claimed that Lilly had been coming in and out of the bedroom earlier that morning, a detail that seemed to support the idea that the children were awake and active. But his description of Jack's activities was limited to sounds, allegedly hearing the 4-year-old making noise in another room. This distinction would become crucial to the investigation. Daniel provided detailed descriptions of what both children were wearing that morning, but when pressed, he admitted that he had never actually seen Jack at all. He had described the 4-year-old's blue boots with dinosaur designs, his clothing, even his demeanor, based entirely on sounds and assumptions. How does someone provide such specific details about a child they never saw? How does a parent figure describe with certainty the appearance and activities of a child who is supposedly in their care, but never actually observed? These questions would become central to investigators' growing suspicions about the family's account. The timeline of the morning becomes even more problematic when examined closely. If the children were last heard around 8:20 a.m., and if their absence was discovered shortly afterward, why wasn't 911 called until 10 a.m.? That's an hour and 40 minutes of unaccounted time in a case where every minute could have been crucial. Malaya and Daniel's explanation for this delay was that they had conducted their own search of the house and surrounding area before calling for help. They claimed to have checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place within the trailer. They also stated that they had ventured into the woods around their property, calling the children's names and looking for any sign of them. But neighbors and later investigators would question whether there was any evidence of such a search. No neighbors reported hearing voices calling for missing children during those crucial 90 minutes. No signs of a frantic search were visible from the road or from neighboring properties. The couple's behavior during this period, as described by first responders, was notably calm and composed. The 911 call itself revealed disturbing details about the family's mindset and priorities. Malaya's voice on the recording was steady, almost matter-of-fact, as she reported that her children were missing. There was no audible panic, no emotional breakdown, no signs of the distress that would typically accompany such a report. Emergency dispatchers are trained to recognize signs of genuine distress versus manufactured concern. While people react differently to crisis situations, the complete absence of emotional response often raises red flags. In this case, the dispatcher noted the unusual calm of the caller, especially given the gravity of the situation. When first responders arrived at the trailer, they found a scene that defied their expectations. Instead of frantic parents continuing to search for their children, they found a couple who seemed almost resigned to the situation. There was no active searching happening when police arrived, no evidence of ongoing efforts to locate the missing children. The descriptions of the children's clothing provided by Daniel would become crucial to the search effort, but they also revealed troubling inconsistencies. His detailed account of Lily's pink shirt and distinctive white backpack with red strawberries was remarkably specific. But when it came to Jack, whom he admitted never seeing that morning, his descriptions were equally detailed. This contradiction would plague the investigation from its earliest hours. How can someone provide crucial evidence about something they never witnessed? How can a parent describe the exact appearance of a child they claim never to have seen? These questions would follow Daniel throughout the investigation and contribute to investigators' growing suspicions about the family's account. The morning of May 2nd also revealed the family's profound isolation from normal support systems. When the children were discovered missing, there were no immediate calls to relatives, no attempts to contact neighbors who might have seen them, no activation of informal community networks that typically spring into action when children go missing. Instead, the family's response was limited to the official channels, the 911 call, and cooperation with responding officers. This isolation, which might have once provided privacy, now highlighted how disconnected the family had become from the community resources that might have helped in a crisis. The physical evidence from the morning was also notably absent. In cases where children genuinely wander off, there are typically signs of their departure: doors left open, toys dropped in haste, footprints leading away from the house. But the trailer showed no signs of hasty departure, no evidence that children had left in a hurry or under their own power. The morning everything changed wasn't just about the disappearance of 2 children. It was about the revelation of a family dynamic that had been hidden behind the isolation of rural living and the privacy of a closed household. The contradictions, the timeline gaps, and the behavioral inconsistencies that emerged from this single morning would shape the entire investigation. As first responders began their initial search of the area, they were working with information that was already compromised by inconsistencies and contradictions. The morning that should have been about finding 2 missing children was instead about trying to understand what had really happened in the hours before they were reported gone. The search was about to begin in earnest, but it was starting with a foundation that was already cracked. The morning everything changed had revealed not just the absence of 2 children, but the presence of questions that would prove far more difficult to answer than anyone could have imagined. Within hours of the 911 call, the quiet forests surrounding Gearlock Road were transformed into the site of one of the most intensive search operations in Nova Scotia's history. The response was swift, comprehensive, and driven by the desperate hope that 6-year-old Lilly and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan were simply lost children who could still be found alive. The initial response team included RCMP officers, local fire services, and experienced search and rescue volunteers. But as the hours passed without any sign of the children, the operation expanded exponentially. By the end of the first day, more than 160 trained professionals were involved in the search effort, representing multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Amy Hansen, the certified search and rescue leader assigned to coordinate ground operations, had overseen dozens of missing person searches throughout her career. She understood the critical importance of the first 24 hours, when the chances of finding missing children alive are highest. What she didn't expect was to encounter a case that would challenge every assumption she had about how children go missing. The search area was defined by a precise GPS grid covering over 5 square kilometers of dense woodland. The terrain was particularly challenging, still scarred by the remnants of Hurricane Fiona from the previous year. Fallen trees created natural barriers and hiding places, while heavy underbrush made visibility nearly impossible beyond a few meters in any direction. The forest itself seemed to work against the searchers. Recent rainfall had turned many paths into muddy, treacherous tracks. The thick canopy above blocked much of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight even during midday hours. And the undergrowth was so dense that even experienced searchers found themselves disoriented within minutes of leaving marked trails. But the search teams were equipped with sophisticated technology and decades of experience. Thermal imaging drones swept overhead, their sensors capable of detecting heat signatures from living beings even through dense vegetation. The drones flew in systematic patterns, scanning every section of the forest multiple times to ensure no area was missed. Helicopters joined the aerial search, their crews using high-powered binoculars and spotting scopes to examine the forest floor from above. The aircraft flew in overlapping search patterns, with crews specially trained to spot signs of human presence in wilderness environments. The sound of rotor blades became a constant presence over the forest, a reminder of the urgency driving the operation. On the ground, canine units were deployed with specially trained tracking dogs. These animals, with their extraordinary sense of smell, are often the key to finding missing persons in wilderness environments. The dogs were given clothing items from the children's rooms to establish scent trails, then released to follow any traces the children might have left behind. But the dog's behavior was puzzling from the start. Typically, tracking dogs will pick up a scent trail and follow it with focused determination. In this case, the dogs seemed confused and directionless. They would circle the immediate area around the trailer, whine, and then lose interest. It was as if the scent trails they were looking for simply didn't exist. The search grid was divided into sectors, with each team responsible for thoroughly examining their assigned area. Searchers worked in systematic patterns, calling out the children's names every few minutes and listening for any response. The sound of voices calling Lilly, Jack, echoed through the forest throughout the day, a haunting chorus of hope and desperation. Volunteers from the local community joined the official search teams, their numbers swelling as word of the missing children spread. These weren't trained professionals, but they brought local knowledge of the terrain and an emotional investment in finding the children. Many had children of their own and understood the urgency of the situation. The community response was remarkable. Local businesses donated supplies, food, and equipment. Residents opened their homes to search teams, providing places to rest and coordinate. The small community of Lansdowne Station, which had seemed so isolated and disconnected, suddenly revealed itself as a network of people willing to do whatever it took to find two missing children. But as the first day progressed, the absence of any evidence became increasingly troubling. In most missing persons cases, even under difficult conditions, searchers find some trace of the person's passage. A footprint in soft earth, a piece of clothing caught on a branch, disturbed vegetation where someone had passed through. These small signs become breadcrumbs that lead searchers in the right direction. The search for Lilly and Jack revealed none of these signs. The forest seemed untouched, as if no children had ever entered it. This absence of evidence was so unusual that experienced searchers began to question their assumptions about what they were looking for. On the second day, the search expanded to include water sources in the area. Specialized dive teams were brought in to examine ponds, creeks, and drainage areas where the children might have fallen or become trapped. These searches were methodical and thorough, with divers examining every submerged log, every depression in the water, every possible hiding place. The water searches revealed nothing. No disturbed sediment, no clothing, no signs that anyone had been in or near the water recently. Like the forest searches, the water operations were characterized by an eerie absence of evidence. It was on the third day that the search team made their only significant discovery. A single bootprint was found in a mossy section of the forest approximately 300 meters from the Sullivan trailer. The print appeared to be small, possibly consistent with a child's foot, and was preserved in the soft, damp moss. The discovery created a surge of hope among the search teams. Finally, there was something concrete to work with, a sign that the children might have been in the forest after all. The area around the bootprint was immediately cordoned off and subjected to intensive examination. Forensic specialists photographed the print from multiple angles, measured it precisely, and compared it to known shoe sizes for the missing children. The print was consistent with what might be expected from a child of Jack's age and size, though it was impossible to make a definitive match without the actual shoes. But the hope generated by the bootprint discovery was short-lived. Despite intensive searching in all directions from the print, no additional tracks were found. No trail leading to or away from the spot, no other signs of human passage, no indication of which direction the children might have gone. The isolated nature of the single bootprint was almost more troubling than finding nothing at all. How does a child leave one clear footprint in soft moss and then vanish without leaving any other trace? The print seemed to exist in isolation, disconnected from any logical pattern of movement through the forest. Investigators began to question whether the bootprint was even related to the missing children. The area had been searched by dozens of people over the previous days, and it was possible that the print had been left by a searcher rather than one of the missing children. Without additional evidence to support it, the bootprint became just another puzzle piece that didn't fit the overall picture. By the end of the first week, the search operation had expanded to include multiple specialized units. In addition to the ground teams, aerial units, and water search teams, investigators brought in specialized equipment including ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. The shift from search and rescue to a more comprehensive investigation was subtle but significant. The ground-penetrating radar was used to examine areas around the family property and along potential travel routes. This technology can detect disturbances in the soil that might indicate buried objects or areas where the earth has been disturbed. The radar surveys revealed nothing unusual, no signs of recent digging or soil disturbance. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of human remains, were brought in to supplement the tracking dogs. These specialized animals can detect traces of decomposition that are invisible to human senses, even in cases where remains have been carefully concealed. The cadaver dogs showed no interest in any area of the forest, finding no scent traces that would indicate the presence of human remains. The massive search operation was consuming enormous resources. The daily cost of maintaining 160 search personnel, multiple aircraft, specialized equipment, and support operations was staggering. But the commitment to finding Lilly and Jack remained unwavering. No expense was spared. No resource was held back in the effort to bring the children home. Community support for the search remained strong throughout the first week. Volunteers continued to join the effort, local businesses maintained their donations of supplies and services, and the story of the missing children began to attract media attention from across the region. But privately, experienced search personnel were beginning to acknowledge what they couldn't say publicly. The complete absence of evidence, the lack of any viable leads, and the inconsistencies in the family's account were creating a picture that didn't match typical missing persons cases. On May 7th, 5 days after the children were reported missing, the search operation was officially scaled back. The decision was made based on the lack of findings and the increasing risk to searchers navigating the difficult terrain. The statement released by authorities was carefully worded, emphasizing that the investigation remained active while acknowledging that the intensive search phase was being reduced. The scaling back of the search was devastating for the community members who had invested so much hope and energy in finding the children. Many volunteers continued informal searches on their own, unable to accept that Lilly and Jack might not be found in the familiar forests of their home community. Aerial surveillance and targeted ground searches continued through May 18th, but these efforts were limited compared to the massive operation of the first week. The helicopters still flew their patterns, the drones still swept the forest, and small teams still walked the difficult terrain, but the sense of urgency had been replaced by grim determination. On May 18th, all coordinated search operations were officially suspended. The forests around Gearlock Road fell silent for the first time in more than 2 weeks. The absence of helicopter rotors, the quiet that replaced the constant calling of the children's names, and the removal of the command posts and equipment created a void that felt almost as profound as the absence of the children themselves. The massive search operation had involved hundreds of people, consumed thousands of hours of professional time, and covered every conceivable area where 2 young children might have wandered. It had employed the most advanced technology available and had been conducted by some of the most experienced search and rescue professionals in the region. And it had found nothing. Not a single piece of clothing, not a toy, not a footprint trail, not even a reliable scent trail for the dogs to follow. The search had revealed an absence so complete that it challenged everything the searchers thought they knew about missing persons cases. The forest kept its secrets, and Lilly and Jack Sullivan remained as missing as they had been on the morning of May 2nd. But the search operation had revealed something else, a pattern of absence that would shift the focus of the investigation from the woods to the people who had last seen the children alive. If you're still with us, make sure to subscribe because this case is about to take turns that will challenge everything you think you know about missing children investigations. The search may have ended, but the real investigation was just beginning. As the massive search operation wound down with no trace of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, investigators began to focus their attention on the family dynamics that had been hidden behind the isolation of rural life. What they discovered was a household that defied easy categorization, marked by contradictions, isolation, and circumstances that raised uncomfortable questions about the children's daily lives. The Sullivan family lived in a white trailer at the end of Gearlock Road, surrounded by dense forest that provided both privacy and complete isolation from the outside world. The nearest neighbors were hundreds of meters away, invisible through the thick trees. There was no cell phone service in the area, no internet connection, and no landline phone service. The family existed in a bubble of isolation that was almost complete. Inside the trailer lived 27-year-old Malaya Brooks Murray, her partner 33-year-old Daniel Martel, and their 3 children. Lilly, 6, and Jack, 4, were Malaya's children from a previous relationship. Meadow, just 16 months old, was the daughter of Malaya and Daniel. The family of 5 lived in close quarters, with little privacy and limited resources. The living conditions, as described by searchers and later investigators, painted a picture of a household struggling to maintain basic standards. The trailer was cluttered, with personal belongings scattered throughout the small space. Multiple animals, several cats, and at least 1 dog, lived inside the cramped quarters, adding to the chaotic atmosphere. But it was the financial situation that raised the most immediate questions. Daniel claimed to work at a local lumber mill, but according to his own statements, he only worked 1 day per week. The mathematics of supporting a family of 5 on 1 day's wages per week simply didn't add up. There were no confirmed government benefits, no unemployment insurance, no disability payments, and no other documented source of income. When pressed by investigators and media about how the family managed financially, Daniel's explanations were vague and inconsistent. He suggested that they got by and made do with what they had, but never provided a clear picture of their economic situation. The absence of receipts, bank records, or other financial documentation from the days before the children's disappearance added another layer of mystery to the case. The family's isolation wasn't just geographic, it was social and cultural as well. Malaya was a member of the Siksikatik First Nation, the largest Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia. Her Indigenous heritage connected her to a rich cultural tradition and an extended family network that could have provided support and oversight for her children. But by moving in with Daniel to the remote trailer in Lansdowne Station, Malaya had effectively severed those connections. She had left behind her cultural community, her extended family, and the support systems that are often crucial for Indigenous families navigating challenges. The isolation from her roots was complete and, according to some who knew her, deeply troubling. Daniel Martel had grown up in Lansdowne Station, living in the same trailer where the children would eventually be reported missing. This was his childhood home, his familiar territory, and his chosen isolation. Just a few feet away from the main trailer was a second dwelling where Daniel's mother lived, creating a family compound of sorts. But the proximity of Daniel's mother didn't translate into additional oversight or support for the children. Investigators found that there was little interaction between the 2 households, despite their physical closeness. The grandmother, who might have provided another layer of protection and care for Lilly and Jack, was largely absent from their daily lives. The property itself told a story of neglect and decline. In addition to the 2 trailers, the grounds were scattered with rusting debris, broken toys, and the detritus of a household that had given up on maintaining appearances. The yard where the children should have played was littered with hazards and obstacles that made safe play difficult. Neighbors, when interviewed by investigators, painted a picture of a family that had become increasingly isolated over time. There were few regular visitors to the property, no social gatherings, no community involvement. The family had gradually withdrawn from the informal networks that typically provide support and oversight in rural communities. The children's connection to the outside world was primarily through their school attendance. Salt Springs Elementary School, with its fewer than 90 students, was where Lilly and Jack experienced normal childhood interactions with peers and caring adults. Their bus driver, Brian Ward, had become one of the few consistent adult figures in their lives outside their immediate household. School records showed that both children were adjusting well to their educational environment. Teachers described them as sometimes quiet but socially appropriate, contradicting later claims about developmental issues. The contrast between the children's behavior at school and the descriptions provided by family members raised questions about their home environment. The family's daily routines, as described by Malaya and Daniel, were characterized by an unusual degree of isolation. There were no regular trips to grocery stores, no visits to relatives, no participation in community events. The children's world seemed to be confined almost entirely to the trailer and the immediately surrounding property. This isolation extended to their health care as well. There were no regular pediatric visits, no vaccination records, no documentation of routine childhood medical care. When Lilly was allegedly sick with a cough in the days before the disappearance, there was no contact with healthcare providers, no purchases of children's medications, no attempt to seek medical advice. The absence of normal childhood documentation was striking. Most families accumulate a paper trail of their children's lives: school records, medical records, photos, receipts from activities, and purchases. The Sullivan children seemed to exist in a void, with remarkably little documentation of their daily existence. The family's relationship with technology was also unusual for the modern era. With no internet access and limited cell phone service, the family was cut off from the digital world that most children take for granted. There were no social media posts featuring the children, no digital photos documenting their lives, no online presence that would confirm their existence. This technological isolation meant that the children's voices were filtered entirely through the adults in their household. There were no independent records of their thoughts, their experiences, or their daily lives. They existed only in the accounts provided by Malaya and Daniel, accounts that were becoming increasingly questionable as the investigation progressed. The extended family situation was particularly complex. Lilly and Jack's biological father was not part of their daily lives, and his family had limited contact with the children. This meant that the normal network of grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins that typically provides oversight and support for children was largely absent. The isolation of the family had created a situation where the children were entirely dependent on two adults for their care, protection, and connection to the outside world. There were no backup systems, no alternative caregivers, no independent advocates who might have noticed if something was wrong. As investigators delved deeper into the family's circumstances, they began to understand how completely Lilly and Jack had been cut off from the world beyond their trailer. The isolation that might have once provided privacy and independence had become something more sinister, a situation where children could disappear from the world without anyone outside their household noticing. The family under the microscope revealed a pattern of isolation, financial instability, and social disconnection that created the perfect conditions for tragedy. The children who should have been protected by multiple layers of community oversight and support had instead been living in a bubble where their existence was known only to the adults who controlled their daily lives. The investigation was about to reveal just how complete that isolation had been and how devastating the consequences would prove to be. The family that had seemed merely private and independent was revealing itself to be something far more troubling, a closed system where children could vanish without a trace. As investigators dug deeper into the Sullivan family's account of the children's disappearance, a pattern of contradictions began to emerge that would fundamentally alter the direction of the investigation. What had started as a missing persons case was evolving into something far more complex, as each new detail seemed to raise more questions than it answered. The timeline inconsistencies were the first major red flag. Initially, Malaya and Daniel had provided what seemed like a straightforward account of the morning of May 2nd. The children were heard playing around 8 a.m., the house fell silent between 8 o'clock and 8:20 a.m., and the 911 call was placed at 10 a.m. Simple, clear, and easily understood. But as investigators pressed for more details, the timeline began to shift and change. The exact time Malaya woke up became uncertain. The duration of the children's play sounds varied in different retellings. The amount of time between noticing the silence and beginning to search for the children grew longer and more vague with each interview. Most troubling of all, the 90-minute gap between allegedly discovering the children were missing and calling 911 was never adequately explained. The couple's account of searching the house and surrounding woods during this time was not supported by any evidence. Neighbors reported no signs of a frantic search, no voices calling for missing children, no activity that would suggest a desperate hunt for lost kids. Daniel Martel's behavior during interviews became increasingly problematic as investigators noticed patterns in his responses. His decision to volunteer for a polygraph test, while seemingly cooperative, raised questions about his motivations. When asked why he wanted to take the test, Daniel's response is telling. He said he wanted to clear his name because he felt the public was turning against him. This response revealed a mindset focused on public perception rather than finding the missing children. Most parents of missing children are focused entirely on the search and rescue efforts, not on their own reputation or public image. Daniel's concern about clearing his name suggested he was already thinking defensively about potential accusations. During one media interview, Daniel made a statement that caught the attention of behavioral analysts and investigators. When asked about his hopes for the investigation, he said, "I just hope they find something." The phrasing was subtle but significant. He didn't say, "I hope they find them," or "I hope they find the children." He said something, a word choice that suggested he might know that the children themselves were beyond finding. Language analysis in criminal investigations focuses on these subtle word choices because they often reveal the speaker's true knowledge or state of mind. Daniel's use of "something" instead of "them" was noted by investigators as potentially significant, though not conclusive on its own. The family's behavior during media appearances also drew scrutiny. Both Malaya and Daniel appeared calm, composed, and well-presented in their interviews. They spoke in measured tones, showed no visible signs of distress, and seemed almost detached from the gravity of the situation. While people react differently to trauma, the complete absence of emotional response was unusual for parents of missing children. Behavioral experts noted that genuine grief and panic are difficult to fake convincingly, while manufactured calm often appears artificial under close examination. The couple's controlled demeanor during media appearances contrasted sharply with the emotional responses typically seen from parents of missing children. Even more troubling was the family's use of past tense when referring to the children. Within days of reporting them missing, both Malaya and Daniel began speaking about Lilly and Jack as if they were already gone. Daniel's comment about Lily's backpack being probably brown now from exposure to the outdoors was particularly noted by investigators. This shift to past tense happened remarkably quickly, before the search operation had even been scaled back. Most parents of missing children maintain hope and speak in present tense for weeks or months, refusing to accept that their children might not be found alive. The rapid shift to past tense suggested a knowledge or acceptance of the children's fate that was inconsistent with their reported timeline. The investigation took a more serious turn when investigators seized the family's electronic devices. Cell phones, computers, and any other digital devices were confiscated and subjected to forensic analysis. The digital forensics team examined call records, text messages, internet search histories, GPS tracking data, and any other electronic evidence that might shed light on the family's activities. While the specific findings of the digital forensics examination were not immediately released to the public, the decision to seize the devices signaled that investigators were no longer treating this as a straightforward missing persons case. The focus had shifted from searching for lost children to investigating potential criminal activity. The family's phone activity in the days before and after the children's disappearance became a particular focus of the investigation. Call records could reveal who the family had been in contact with, when calls were made, and from what locations. Text messages might contain evidence of planning, guilt, or knowledge about the children's fate. GPS tracking data from the phones could potentially reveal the family's movements during the critical period when the children were allegedly last seen. If the phones had been taken to locations not mentioned in the family's account, it could provide crucial evidence about what really happened to Lilly and Jack. Internet search histories can be particularly revealing in criminal cases. Searches for topics like body disposal, missing persons procedures, or legal advice can provide insight into a person's knowledge and intentions. While the specific search histories from the Sullivan family's devices were not made public, the seizure of the devices suggested that investigators believed there might be incriminating evidence to be found. The investigation also revealed administrative failures that added to the family's frustration and public criticism. On the 11th day of the investigation, the RCMP released a media bulletin intended to renew public interest in the case. However, the bulletin contained a glaring error. Lilly's name was misspelled throughout the document. This mistake, while seemingly minor, was seized upon by critics as evidence of the RCMP's lack of attention to detail in a case that demanded precision and care. The misspelling of a missing child's name in an official document was seen as disrespectful to the family and indicative of broader problems with the investigation. The error was particularly damaging because it occurred during a period when public confidence in the investigation was already declining. The lack of progress in finding the children, combined with growing questions about the family's account, had created a situation where any mistake by law enforcement was magnified and criticized. Public tips and information continued to pour in throughout the investigation. Over 355 contacts were received by investigators within the first 2 weeks, demonstrating the public's engagement with the case. More than 50 formal interviews were conducted with relatives, neighbors, school personnel, and community members. Despite this massive effort to gather information, not a single credible sighting of the children was reported after May 1st. No one could independently verify having seen Lilly or Jack alive after that date, more than 24 hours before they were reported missing. The absence of any confirmed sightings during this critical period became a cornerstone of investigators' growing suspicions. The family dynamic also began to show signs of strain as the investigation intensified. The stress of being under constant scrutiny, combined with the failure to find the children, began to take its toll on Malaya and Daniel's relationship. Subtle signs of tension became apparent during their joint media appearances, and sources close to the family reported increasing conflict between the couple. By the 3rd week of May, the cracks in the family's united front were becoming visible. Malaya's behavior began to change, and she started to distance herself from some of the earlier statements made on behalf of the family. This shift in her position would soon lead to a dramatic development in the case. The contradictions and red flags that had emerged during the first weeks of the investigation were creating a picture that was increasingly difficult to reconcile with the family's account of what had happened. The missing children case was evolving into something far more complex and disturbing as investigators began to suspect that the truth about Lilly and Jack Sullivan's disappearance had been hidden behind a web of lies and misdirection. The investigation was about to take a dramatic turn that would shatter the family's carefully constructed narrative and reveal the true nature of what had happened to 2 innocent children. The contradictions were mounting, the red flags were multiplying, and the truth was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows of Gearlock Road. 3 weeks after Lilly and Jack Sullivan were reported missing, their case had captured the attention of the entire region. Media outlets from across Atlantic Canada were following the story, and the family found themselves at the center of intense public scrutiny. It was during this period that Malaya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martel made a series of public statements that would prove to be among the most analyzed and controversial aspects of the entire investigation. The couple's media appearances were carefully arranged through the RCMP's communications department, designed to generate renewed public interest in the case and potentially generate new leads. What they actually accomplished was something far different. They provided investigators and the public with a window into the family's mindset that raised more questions than it answered. In their first televised interview, broadcast on May 15th, Malaya and Daniel appeared composed and well-prepared. They sat side by side in matching chairs, their clothing neat and their demeanor calm. The setting was professional, the lighting was good, and their responses were articulate and detailed. For parents of missing children, they seemed remarkably put together. When we noticed that the children were gone, we immediately jumped in the vehicle and surveyed all the area, many dirt roads, many culverts, as much as we could, and waited for the police to get there, Malaya explained to the interviewer. Her voice was steady, her eye contact was direct, and her account was precise. But behavioral analysts who reviewed the interview noted several concerning elements. The language was formal and practiced, as if the couple had rehearsed their responses. The emotional tone was flat, lacking the desperation and anguish typically associated with parents of missing children. Most troubling of all, both speakers consistently used past tense when referring to the children. Daniel's description of the children's belongings was particularly detailed and specific. He spoke at length about Lilly's favorite backpack, describing it as white with red strawberries. But then he added a comment that chilled investigators. "It's probably brown now," he said, "from being out in the elements all this time." This casual reference to the deterioration of his stepdaughter's belongings suggested a level of acceptance about the children's fate that was inconsistent with ongoing hope for their safe return. Most parents of missing children refuse to contemplate such details, maintaining hope against all odds that their children will be found alive and well. The couple's media strategy seemed designed to deflect suspicion rather than generate leads. They spoke about their cooperation with investigators, their willingness to take polygraph tests, and their frustration with public speculation about their involvement. But they provided remarkably little information about the children themselves, their personalities, their fears, their favorite activities, the things that made them unique individuals. When asked about the children's daily routines, the couple's responses were vague and generic. They spoke about normal childhood activities, but provided few specific details that would help the public understand who Lilly and Jack really were. The absence of personal anecdotes and specific memories was noted by investigators as potentially significant. The timing of their media appearances also raised questions. The couple seemed more interested in managing their public image than in maintaining focus on the search for their children. Their appearances were coordinated with legal representation, and their statements were carefully crafted to avoid potentially incriminating admissions. But it was their body language and behavioral cues that drew the most attention from experts in criminal psychology. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist who specializes in analyzing behavior in criminal cases, noted several concerning patterns in the couple's public appearances. The absence of genuine emotional distress is unusual in cases involving missing children, Dr. Chen observed. While people react differently to trauma, the complete lack of visible anxiety, desperation, or grief is statistically uncommon among parents of missing children. The controlled demeanor and carefully crafted responses suggest a different set of priorities than we typically see in these cases. The couple's use of language also drew scrutiny from linguistic experts. Their consistent use of past tense, their formal and distanced descriptions of the children, and their focus on procedural details rather than emotional appeals were all noted as potentially significant. Professor Michael Davidson, a linguist who studies speech patterns in criminal cases, analyzed transcripts of the couple's media appearances. The language patterns suggest speakers who are maintaining emotional distance from the subjects they're discussing, he noted. The children are described in ways that suggest they're being remembered rather than mourned as missing persons who might still be found. The public reaction to the media appearances was swift and largely negative. Social media platforms filled with comments questioning the couple's sincerity and expressing suspicion about their involvement in the children's disappearance. The carefully orchestrated media strategy, designed to generate sympathy, had instead generated suspicion. Online communities dedicated to analyzing missing persons cases began dissecting every word, every gesture, every facial expression from the couple's appearances. Frame-by-frame analysis of their body language, linguistic analysis of their word choices, and behavioral analysis of their responses became common topics of discussion. The couple's calm demeanor was repeatedly contrasted with the emotional responses typically seen from parents of missing children. Videos of other parents making desperate pleas for their children's safe return were shared alongside the Sullivan family's composed statements, highlighting the stark difference in emotional presentation. Local community members who had participated in the search efforts began expressing their own doubts about the family's account. Many had spent days walking through difficult terrain, driven by the hope that they might find two lost children. The growing evidence that the children might not have been in the forest at all was devastating to these volunteers. "We gave everything we had to find those kids," said Margaret Thompson, a local resident who had joined the search efforts. "We walked through brush that tore our clothes. We climbed over fallen trees. We searched every possible hiding place. To think that we might have been searching for children who weren't even out there, it's heartbreaking." The couple's apparent lack of gratitude for the community's efforts was also noted by local residents. While they acknowledged the search efforts in their media appearances, their responses seemed perfunctory rather than heartfelt. They showed little emotional connection to the hundreds of people who had devoted their time and energy to looking for the children. The contrast between the community's emotional investment in finding the children and the parents' detached presentations created a growing sense of betrayal among local residents. The people who had given so much to help find Lilly and Jack began to question whether their efforts had been based on lies. The media appearances also revealed inconsistencies in the couple's account that hadn't been apparent in their initial statements to investigators. Details about the timeline, the children's activities, and the family's response to the disappearance changed subtly between interviews, creating a pattern of shifting narratives that raised additional questions. Daniel's admission that he had never actually seen Jack on the morning of the disappearance, despite providing detailed descriptions of the child's clothing and activities, became a focal point of public criticism. The contradiction between his detailed knowledge and his admitted lack of direct observation was seen as evidence of deception. The couple's decision to continue making media appearances even as public suspicion grew was puzzling to many observers. Most families in similar situations become more private and protective as investigations progress, focusing on cooperation with law enforcement rather than public relations. The Sullivan family's continued media presence suggested different priorities. The final media appearance by the couple together was broadcast on May 22nd, exactly 3 weeks after the children were reported missing. By this time, the tone of the interviews had shifted from supportive to skeptical, with journalists asking more direct questions about the inconsistencies in their account. The couple's responses to these more challenging questions were notably less composed than their earlier appearances. Signs of stress and irritation became apparent, and their carefully maintained facade began to crack under pressure. The final interview would be their last joint public appearance, as the investigation was about to take a dramatic turn that would shatter their united front. The media appearances that were supposed to keep the focus on finding missing children had instead revealed a family whose behavior was increasingly difficult to reconcile with their stated grief and concern. They had spoken for the dead, as it turned out, rather than for the living, and their words would come back to haunt them as the investigation moved into its most intensive phase. The public had heard enough, and investigators were about to act on the mounting evidence that the truth about Lilly and Jack Sullivan's disappearance was very different from what their caregivers had claimed. The time for careful public statements was ending, and the time for accountability was about to begin. The absence of an Amber Alert in the Lilly and Jack Sullivan case became a flashpoint for criticism that extended far beyond the specifics of this investigation. The decision not to issue an alert revealed systemic issues in how missing children cases are handled, particularly when those children come from marginalized communities or live in remote areas. The RCMP's classification of the case as a vulnerable missing persons situation rather than an abduction met the technical requirements of their protocols, but it failed to capture the urgency that the community felt was warranted. The criteria for issuing an Amber Alert in Nova Scotia require confirmation of an abduction, a detailed description of the suspect or vehicle, and reasonable belief that the child is in imminent danger. In the Sullivan case, none of these criteria were definitively met in the first hours after the children were reported missing. There was no confirmed abduction, no suspect vehicle, and no witness to the children being taken against their will. The family's account suggested that the children had wandered off on their own, which doesn't meet the threshold for an Amber Alert. But critics argued that the rigid application of these criteria ignored the unique circumstances of the case. 2 very young children, aged 4 and 6, had disappeared from a remote location surrounded by dangerous terrain. The risk to their safety was immediate and severe, regardless of whether they had been abducted or had wandered off on their own. Chief Michelle Glasgow of the Siksikatik First Nation was among the first to publicly question the decision not to issue an Amber Alert. Speaking to media on May 7th, 5 days after the children were reported missing, she raised concerns that went beyond the technical requirements of the alert system. "These children belong to our community," Chief Glasgow stated. "They are Mi'kmaq children, and they deserve the same level of urgent response that would be given to any other missing children. The delay in issuing an alert may have cost precious time, that could have saved their lives. Chief Glasgow's statement highlighted a troubling pattern in how missing persons cases involving Indigenous children are handled. Statistical analysis of Amber Alert issuance in Canada shows that alerts are less likely to be issued for Indigenous children, particularly those living in remote or rural areas. The reasons for this disparity are complex and multifaceted. Indigenous children are more likely to live in remote areas where communication infrastructure is limited, making it difficult to distribute alerts effectively. They may also be more likely to live in unstable housing situations or with non-biological caregivers, which can complicate the investigation and delay the determination of whether an abduction has occurred. But critics argue that these factors represent systemic discrimination rather than legitimate operational concerns. The failure to issue an Amber Alert for Lilly and Jack Sullivan was seen as part of a broader pattern of undervaluing Indigenous children's lives and safety. The family's isolation from their Indigenous community also played a role in the delayed response. Malaya's decision to move away from the Siksikatik First Nation and live with Daniel in a remote area had severed many of the traditional support networks that might have provided earlier intervention. In Indigenous communities, extended family networks and community elders often play crucial roles in child protection. They provide informal monitoring and support that can identify problems before they escalate to crisis levels. When families become isolated from these networks, children become more vulnerable to harm. The geographical isolation of the Sullivan family home on Gearlock Road also contributed to the delayed response. The nearest neighbor was over a kilometer away, and the property was not visible from the main road. This isolation meant that the children's disappearance could go unnoticed for hours or even days without anyone outside the family knowing. The terrain surrounding the property presented additional challenges for search and rescue operations. The dense forest, swampy areas, and rough terrain made it difficult to conduct thorough searches and required specialized equipment and training that took time to mobilize. Weather conditions also played a role in the response. The aftermath of Hurricane Fiona had left many areas inaccessible, and the risk of further severe weather limited the hours when search operations could be conducted safely. These factors combined to create a perfect storm of circumstances that hindered the initial response to the children's disappearance. But critics argued that these challenges should have prompted a more aggressive response, not a more cautious one. The case highlighted the need for emergency response protocols that are flexible enough to account for the unique circumstances of each case, particularly when vulnerable children are involved. The rigid application of criteria designed for urban abduction scenarios proved inadequate for a case involving young Indigenous children in a remote rural setting. The failure to issue an Amber Alert became a rallying point for advocates calling for reform of missing persons protocols. They argued that the system needed to be redesigned to better serve all children, regardless of their race, location, or family circumstances. The controversy also raised questions about the adequacy of resources allocated to missing persons investigations in remote areas. The specialized equipment, trained personnel, and communication infrastructure needed for effective search and rescue operations were not readily available in the rural areas where many Indigenous families live. These systemic issues would continue to plague the investigation as it moved into its second week, with mounting criticism from the community and growing questions about whether everything possible was being done to find Lilly and Jack Sullivan. As the search for Lilly and Jack Sullivan entered its second week, the investigation underwent a significant escalation. The Nova Scotia RCMP's Major Crime Unit officially took over the case on May 9th, 7 days after the children were first reported missing. This transition marked a shift from a missing persons investigation to something more serious, though officials remained careful not to specify exactly what they suspected had occurred. The Major Crime Unit's involvement brought additional resources and expertise to the investigation, but it also signaled that investigators were no longer confident the children would be found alive. The unit typically handles homicides, serious assaults, and other major criminal investigations, and their involvement suggested that the case had moved beyond a simple missing persons matter. Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison, who took over as lead investigator, brought 15 years of experience in major crime investigations to the case. Her first priority was to conduct a comprehensive review of everything that had been done in the first week of the investigation, looking for any leads or evidence that might have been missed. What she found was both impressive and frustrating. The search effort had been massive and thorough, involving 160 trained professionals, multiple aircraft, specialized search dogs, and state-of-the-art equipment. Every accessible area within a 5-kilometer radius of the Sullivan property had been searched multiple times. The investigation had generated 355 tips from the public, each of which had been followed up and investigated. Yet despite all of this effort, the investigation had produced virtually no useful evidence. The single bootprint found near the property remained the only physical evidence that the children had ever been there, and even that was of questionable value given the time that had elapsed between the children's disappearance and its discovery. The lack of evidence was unprecedented in Detective Inspector Morrison's experience. Even in cases where children had wandered off into wilderness areas and died from exposure, there were typically some traces left behind: torn clothing caught on branches, footprints in soft soil, or scent trails that dogs could follow. The complete absence of any such evidence in the Sullivan case was deeply puzzling. The investigation team conducted a detailed review of the timeline, looking for any inconsistencies or gaps that might provide clues about what had really happened. They created a minute-by-minute reconstruction of the family's activities in the days leading up to the children's disappearance, cross-referencing Daniel and Malaya's statements with any available corroborating evidence. What emerged was a timeline full of gaps and inconsistencies. The family's account of the children's activities on April 30th and May 1st could not be independently verified. There were no witnesses to confirm that the children had been sick and staying home from school. No medical records documented any illness or treatment. The investigation team also noted discrepancies in how Daniel and Malaya described their own activities during this period. Daniel claimed to have been working on May 1st, but his employer had no record of him being at the job site that day. Malaya's account of her activities was vague and changed slightly each time she was interviewed. The team conducted formal interviews with 50 individuals connected to the case, including family members, neighbors, school personnel, and anyone who had reported seeing the children in the days before their disappearance. Each interview was recorded and transcribed, and the statements were carefully analyzed for any contradictions or new information. The interviews revealed a troubling pattern of isolation surrounding the Sullivan family. Many of the people interviewed described the family as withdrawn and difficult to get to know. Teachers at the children's school reported that Lilly and Jack were often absent and that when they did attend, they seemed tired and sometimes hungry. Several neighbors mentioned that they rarely saw the children playing outside or interacting with other kids in the area. The family didn't participate in community events or maintain close relationships with others in the neighborhood. This isolation made it difficult to establish a clear picture of the children's normal routines and behavior patterns. The investigation team also conducted a thorough digital forensics examination of the family's electronic devices. This included cell phones, computers, tablets, and any other devices that might contain relevant information. The examination looked for evidence of communications, internet searches, location data, and any other digital traces that might shed light on the case. The digital investigation revealed some interesting patterns. Daniel's phone showed very limited activity in the days leading up to the children's disappearance. His internet search history included several queries about wilderness survival and search and rescue procedures, but these searches were dated after the children went missing and could be explained by his stated concern about their disappearance. Malaya's phone showed more activity, but much of it was routine social media use and communications with family members. However, investigators noted that she had deleted a significant amount of data from her phone in the days following the children's disappearance. When questioned about this, she claimed it was routine cleaning of old photos and messages, but the timing raised suspicions. The investigation also revealed financial pressures facing the family. Bank records showed that Daniel and Malaya were struggling financially, with overdue bills and very little savings. Daniel's employment was sporadic, and the family relied heavily on government assistance to meet their basic needs. While financial stress alone doesn't explain a child's disappearance, investigators knew that economic pressures could contribute to family dysfunction and, in extreme cases, lead to desperate actions. The financial records became another piece of the puzzle that investigators were trying to assemble. As the investigation deepened, the strain on the family became increasingly apparent. Daniel and Malaya's relationship began to show signs of serious stress. They were spending less time together and seemed to be avoiding each other during police interviews and public appearances. The intense scrutiny from law enforcement, media, and the public was taking its toll on both parents. They were receiving threats and harassment through social media and phone calls. Some members of the community had begun to openly express suspicions about their involvement in the children's disappearance. The investigation team was also dealing with pressure from multiple sources. The public was demanding answers, the media was reporting on every development, and senior officials were asking for regular updates on the case's progress. The lack of concrete leads or evidence was frustrating for everyone involved. Despite the challenges, Detective Inspector Morrison remained determined to find the truth about what had happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan. She knew that somewhere in the mountain of evidence, witness statements, and digital data, there had to be clues that would lead to answers. The investigation was far from over, but the window for finding the children alive was rapidly closing. By the third week of May, the cracks in the Sullivan family's united front had become impossible to ignore. The strain of the investigation, combined with the intense public scrutiny and growing suspicions about their involvement in their children's disappearance, had begun to tear the family apart from within. The first major fracture came on May 18th, when Malaya made the decision to leave the family property on Gearlock Road. She packed her belongings and moved in with her sister in Truro, citing the need for space and time to process what had happened. Her departure was sudden and unexpected, catching even the investigating officers by surprise. "I can't stay there anymore," Malaya told Detective Inspector Morrison during a hastily arranged interview. "Every room, every corner of that place reminds me of them. I keep hearing their voices, their laughter. I keep expecting them to come running through the door." But those close to the investigation suspected that Malaya's departure was motivated by more than just grief and painful memories. The relationship between Daniel and Malaya had become increasingly strained as the investigation progressed. They were no longer presenting a united front to investigators, and their accounts of events were beginning to diverge in subtle but significant ways. Daniel's reaction to Malaya's departure was telling. Rather than expressing understanding or support for her decision, he seemed angry and betrayed. In conversations with neighbors and investigators, he began to make veiled references to Malaya's reliability and mental state, suggesting that the stress of the situation had affected her ability to think clearly. "She's not herself right now," Daniel told investigators. "The pressure has gotten to her. She's saying things, thinking things that don't make sense. I don't know if you can trust everything she tells you." These comments marked a significant shift in Daniel's approach to the investigation. Previously, he had been protective of Malaya and had presented their relationship as strong and supportive. Now, he seemed to be positioning himself as the more reliable and trustworthy parent, while subtly undermining Malaya's credibility. Malaya's departure also allowed investigators to interview her separately, without Daniel's presence or influence. These interviews revealed a different side of the story, one that painted a more complex picture of the family dynamics and the events leading up to the children's disappearance. In her interviews, Malaya described feeling increasingly isolated and controlled in her relationship with Daniel. She spoke of his anger and his tendency to blame her for problems in their relationship. She also revealed that their financial situation was more desperate than they had previously admitted, and that Daniel had been under increasing pressure to find steady employment. "He was angry all the time," Malaya told investigators. "Nothing I did was right. He blamed me for everything, for the kids being difficult, for our money problems, for his trouble finding work. He said I was holding him back, that his life would be better without us." These revelations cast the children's disappearance in a new light. If Daniel had been feeling trapped and resentful about his family responsibilities, it was possible that he had seen the children as obstacles to his freedom and happiness. The theory that the children had simply wandered off began to seem less plausible as more details about the family's dysfunction emerged. The investigation team also noticed changes in both parents' social media presence during this period. Daniel's Facebook and Instagram accounts, which had been filled with pleas for information about the children in the first weeks after their disappearance, became increasingly focused on defending himself against what he characterized as unfair suspicions and accusations. "People are judging me without knowing the facts," Daniel posted on Facebook. "They're making assumptions about me and my family based on rumors and lies. I loved my kids more than anything in the world, and I would never do anything to hurt them. The truth will come out eventually, and when it does, all these people spreading lies will have to answer for what they've done." Malaya's social media activity told a different story. Her posts became increasingly cryptic and emotional, filled with references to guilt, forgiveness, and the need to tell the truth. She posted quotes about the importance of honesty and the weight of keeping secrets. To many observers, these posts seemed like the words of someone struggling with knowledge of what had really happened to the children. One particularly striking post, shared on May 22nd, read, "The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to hide it. Sometimes the hardest thing is living with what you know, especially when speaking up might destroy everything you have left." The post was deleted within hours, but not before it had been screenshot and shared widely on social media. Many interpreted it as a coded confession or at least an admission that there was more to the story than what had been publicly revealed. The investigation team was also analyzing the complete absence of physical evidence in the case. The lack of any traces of the children, no clothing, no footprints, no scent trails, was unprecedented in similar cases. Even in situations where children had died from exposure or accidents in wilderness areas, there were typically some remains or evidence found eventually. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a forensic anthropologist consulted on the case, expressed puzzlement at the complete absence of evidence. "In my experience, it's virtually impossible for two children to disappear so completely without leaving some trace," she told investigators. "Even in cases where bodies have been intentionally concealed, there are usually some clues: disturbed soil, unusual scent patterns, or changes in vegetation that can be detected by trained professionals." The absence of evidence was particularly striking given the intensive search efforts that had been conducted. The area around the Sullivan property had been searched multiple times by highly trained professionals using the most advanced equipment available. The fact that nothing had been found suggested either that the children had never been in the area where they were supposed to have disappeared, or that their disappearance had been carefully planned and executed. The investigation team began to focus more heavily on the possibility that the children's disappearance was not a random event or accident, but rather a deliberate act by someone with knowledge of the area and access to the children. This shift in focus brought increased scrutiny to the family members, particularly Daniel, who had the most detailed knowledge of the property and the surrounding area. The community's reaction to these developments was mixed. Some residents expressed relief that the investigation was finally focusing on what they saw as the most likely explanation for the children's disappearance. Others worried that the focus on the family was preventing investigators from pursuing other leads that might lead to finding the children alive. "We all want answers," said Margaret Thompson, a neighbor who had participated in the initial search efforts. "But we also want to make sure that the investigation is thorough and fair. These children deserve justice, but so does anyone who might be falsely accused of harming them." The tension in the community was palpable as the investigation entered its fourth week. The initial unity and support for the family had given way to suspicion and division. Some residents continued to believe in the family's innocence, while others were convinced that the answers to the children's disappearance lay closer to home than anyone had initially suspected. As May drew to a close, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. The evidence was circumstantial but troubling. The family was fracturing under pressure, and the community was demanding answers. The silence that surrounded the children's disappearance was beginning to speak volumes about what might have really happened on that spring morning when Lilly and Jack Sullivan vanished without a trace. As summer arrived in Nova Scotia, the case of Lilly and Jack Sullivan had evolved from a missing persons investigation into something far more complex and troubling. Nearly 2 months had passed since the children's disappearance, and despite the exhaustive efforts of law enforcement, the community, and volunteers, there were still no concrete answers about what had happened to them. The investigation had consumed enormous resources. The RCMP had assigned their most experienced investigators to the case, conducting hundreds of interviews, following up on thousands of tips, and employing every available technology in their search for the children. The financial cost of the investigation was estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the emotional and social costs were immeasurable. Yet for all the effort and resources invested, the case remained as mysterious as it had been on the morning of May 2nd when Daniel first called 911. The investigation had uncovered troubling questions about the family's circumstances, the timeline of events, and the behavior of the parents, but it had failed to produce the definitive evidence needed to bring charges or provide closure to the community. The lack of resolution was particularly frustrating for Detective Inspector Morrison, who had spent decades solving complex criminal cases. "In my experience, even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces," she explained to her supervisors. "The complete absence of physical evidence in this case is unprecedented. It suggests either extraordinary luck or extraordinary planning." The investigation team had explored every possible theory about what might have happened to the children. They had considered the possibility that the children had wandered off and died from exposure, that they had been abducted by strangers, that they had been taken by someone known to the family, or that they had been harmed by family members. Each theory had been thoroughly investigated, but none had produced conclusive evidence. The theory that the children had simply wandered off and become lost in the wilderness had been the first to be thoroughly tested. The massive search effort had covered every accessible area within a wide radius of the family property. Trained search dogs had been used to try to pick up the children's scent, but they had found nothing. Even areas that were difficult to reach had been searched by specialized teams, but no trace of the children had been found. The possibility of stranger abduction had also been extensively investigated. The investigation team had looked into known sex offenders in the area, had analyzed traffic patterns on the day of the disappearance, and had followed up on numerous reported sightings of the children. None of these leads had produced credible evidence of an abduction. The theory that someone known to the family had taken the children had been complicated by the family's isolation. The Sullivans had few close friends or regular visitors, and those who did know the family had been thoroughly investigated and cleared of suspicion. The children's biological father had been contacted and had provided an alibi for his whereabouts during the relevant time period. This left the most troubling possibility, that the children had been harmed by someone within their own family. The investigation had uncovered numerous red flags that suggested this possibility, but it had failed to produce the concrete evidence needed to support charges. The timeline discrepancies remained unexplained. Daniel and Malaya's accounts of their activities in the days before the children's disappearance could not be independently verified. Their behavior during the investigation had been inconsistent with what would be expected from innocent parents. Their relationship had deteriorated under pressure, and they had begun to contradict each other in subtle but significant ways. The financial pressures facing the family had been documented, as had the dysfunction in Daniel and Malaya's relationship. Malaya's departure from the family home had been followed by increasingly bitter exchanges between the parents, each of whom seemed to be positioning themselves as the more reliable and trustworthy party. But suspicions and circumstantial evidence are not the same as proof. The Crown Attorney's Office had reviewed the evidence multiple times and had concluded that there was insufficient evidence to support charges against anyone. The case remained open, but it was effectively stalled. The impact on the community had been profound. The initial outpouring of support for the family had given way to suspicion and division. Some residents continued to believe in the family's innocence and felt that the investigation had been unfairly focused on them. Others were convinced that the answers lay within the family and were frustrated by the lack of charges. The case had also highlighted broader issues about how missing children cases are handled, particularly when those children come from marginalized communities. The delay in issuing an Amber Alert had sparked criticism and calls for reform of emergency response protocols. The investigation had exposed gaps in the social safety net that might have prevented the tragedy if it had been properly functioning. For the extended Sullivan family, the ordeal had been devastating. Malaya's family had struggled with questions about their own role in the children's disappearance. They wondered if they should have intervened earlier, if they should have been more involved in the children's lives, if they should have pushed harder for answers about the family's circumstances. "We keep asking ourselves if we could have done something different," said Malaya's sister, Patricia. "Maybe if we had been more involved, maybe if we had asked more questions, maybe if we had pushed harder when we had concerns. But you can't force someone to accept help, and you can't force someone to tell you the truth." The case had also taken a toll on the investigating officers. Detective Inspector Morrison had worked on many difficult cases during her career, but the Sullivan case had been particularly challenging. The combination of missing children, uncooperative witnesses, and the complete absence of physical evidence had made it one of the most frustrating investigations of her career. "The hardest part is not knowing," she said. "In most cases, even when we can't prove what happened, we have a pretty good idea of the truth. In this case, we have theories and suspicions, but we don't have answers. That's hard to live with when you're talking about two innocent children." The media attention had also been intense and sometimes counterproductive. The case had attracted national and international attention, with news outlets, podcasters, and online amateur investigators all offering their own theories about what had happened to the children. Some of this attention had been helpful in generating tips and keeping the case in the public eye, but much of it had been sensationalized and had made the investigation more difficult. The online speculation and conspiracy theories had been particularly troubling. Social media platforms had become forums for wild accusations and unfounded theories about the family's involvement in the children's disappearance. While some of this speculation had been based on legitimate concerns about the evidence, much of it had been driven by prejudice and assumptions about the family's lifestyle and background. The case had also exposed the limitations of the legal system in dealing with cases where the evidence is circumstantial and the witnesses are uncooperative. The standard of proof required for criminal charges is necessarily high, but this high standard can sometimes prevent justice from being served in cases where the evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. As the summer of 2025 progressed, the case of Lilly and Jack Sullivan remained officially open but effectively dormant. The investigation team continued to follow up on occasional tips and to review the evidence for any clues that might have been missed, but the active phase of the investigation had largely concluded. The children's fate remained unknown, their voices silenced, their stories untold. The case had raised more questions than it had answered, and it had left a community struggling with the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to two innocent children who had simply vanished one spring morning. As the first anniversary of Lilly and Jack Sullivan's disappearance approached, their case had become more than just an unsolved mystery. It had evolved into a symbol of systemic failures, missed opportunities, and the urgent need for reform in how society protects its most vulnerable children. The children's story had resonated far beyond the borders of Nova Scotia, sparking conversations about child welfare, Indigenous rights, rural poverty, and the adequacy of emergency response systems across Canada. Their names had become synonymous with the broader issues that their case had exposed, and their memory had become a rallying point for advocates calling for change. The most immediate impact of the case had been on emergency response protocols. The controversy over the decision not to issue an Amber Alert had prompted a comprehensive review of the criteria and procedures used to determine when alerts should be issued. The review had concluded that the existing criteria were too rigid and failed to account for the unique circumstances that can arise in cases involving vulnerable children. As a result, new guidelines had been implemented that gave authorities more flexibility in issuing alerts when children are at risk, even if the strict criteria for confirmed abduction cannot be met. The Lilly and Jack Protocol, as it became known, specifically addressed cases involving very young children, Indigenous children, and children living in remote or dangerous environments. The case had also prompted changes in how missing children investigations are conducted. The delay in escalating the Sullivan case to the Major Crime Unit had been identified as a critical error that may have cost valuable time in the crucial early hours of the investigation. New protocols now require that cases involving missing children under the age of 7 be automatically escalated to major crime units within 24 hours, regardless of the suspected circumstances of their disappearance. Training programs for law enforcement officers had been expanded to include more comprehensive education about the unique challenges facing Indigenous families and communities. The isolation of the Sullivan family from their Indigenous community had been identified as a risk factor that should have triggered additional scrutiny and support services. The case had also led to increased funding for search and rescue operations in remote areas. The challenges faced by searchers in the difficult terrain around the Sullivan property had highlighted the need for better equipment, training, and coordination in rural search operations. New investments had been made in specialized equipment and technology that could improve the effectiveness of searches in challenging environments. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the case had been its impact on child welfare systems. The investigation had revealed that there had been warning signs about the Sullivan family's circumstances that had not been properly addressed by social services. The family's isolation, financial stress, and the children's irregular school attendance had all been documented, but no comprehensive assessment of the children's welfare had been conducted. The case had prompted a review of child welfare protocols and had led to new requirements for more proactive intervention when warning signs are identified. Social workers now receive additional training in recognizing the signs of family dysfunction and are required to conduct more thorough assessments when concerns are raised about a child's welfare. The Indigenous community had also mobilized in response to the case. Chief Michelle Glasgow had continued to be a vocal advocate for reforms to better protect Indigenous children. Her efforts had led to the establishment of new cultural liaison programs that work to maintain connections between Indigenous children and their communities, even when families choose to live outside traditional community boundaries. Lilly and Jack were our children, Chief Glasgow had said at a memorial service held on the first anniversary of their disappearance. They belong to our community, and we failed to protect them. But their memory will inspire us to do better, to be more vigilant, to ensure that no other Indigenous children are lost to neglect or indifference. The case had also had a profound impact on the broader conversation about rural poverty and its effects on children. The Sullivan family's financial struggles and social isolation had been identified as contributing factors to the tragedy, prompting new initiatives to provide support services to families living in remote areas. Community organizations had developed new outreach programs specifically designed to identify and assist isolated families. These programs focused on providing practical support, such as transportation to medical appointments and access to social services, as well as emotional support and connection to community resources. The educational system had also been affected by the case. The children's irregular school attendance had been documented but not adequately addressed, leading to reforms in how schools monitor and respond to chronic absenteeism. New protocols required schools to conduct home visits and welfare checks when students miss significant amounts of school time without adequate explanation. For the Sullivan family, the legacy of the case had been mixed. Daniel had eventually left Nova Scotia, reportedly moving to Western Canada to start a new life away from the scrutiny and suspicion that had surrounded him. His departure had been seen by many as an admission of guilt, though he had never been charged with any crime related to the children's disappearance. Malaya had remained in Nova Scotia, living quietly with her sister and receiving support from Indigenous community organizations. She had largely avoided public attention, but those who knew her described her as a broken woman, haunted by the loss of her children and the unanswered questions about their fate. "She carries the weight of not knowing," said Patricia, Malaya's sister. "Every day, she wakes up wondering if today will be the day we get answers. Every phone call, every knock on the door, she hopes it will be news about Lilly and Jack. But it never is." The case had also had a lasting impact on the community of Siknikatik and the surrounding area. The initial unity and support that had characterized the early days of the search had given way to lasting divisions and suspicions. Some residents had moved away, unable to live with the uncertainty and the constant reminders of the tragedy. But the case had also brought out the best in many people. Volunteers who had participated in the search efforts had continued to support other missing persons cases and had formed lasting organizations dedicated to helping families in crisis. The tragedy had created a network of people committed to ensuring that other families would not have to face similar ordeals alone. The media attention surrounding the case had also had a lasting impact. The story had been covered by major news outlets, featured in documentaries, and become the subject of numerous podcasts and online discussions. This attention had kept the case in the public eye and had helped to generate ongoing tips and leads, though none had led to significant breakthroughs. The online communities that had formed around the case had also continued to discuss and analyze the evidence, sometimes providing new insights and perspectives that had been helpful to investigators. However, these communities had also been sources of harmful speculation and conspiracy theories that had added to the family suffering. As the case entered its second year, the official investigation remained open but largely inactive. Detective Inspector Morrison had retired from the RCMP, citing the emotional toll of the unsolved case as a contributing factor to her decision to leave law enforcement. Her replacement had reviewed the evidence and had concluded that there were no new leads to pursue without fresh evidence or witness cooperation. The case had also been reviewed by independent experts and cold case specialists, but none had been able to identify new avenues for investigation. The complete absence of physical evidence remained the most significant obstacle to solving the case, and without new developments, it seemed likely that the fate of Lilly and Jack Sullivan would remain unknown. But their memory continued to inspire action and reform. The anniversary of their disappearance had been marked by ceremonies and memorial services that honored their lives and recommitted the community to preventing similar tragedies. Their names have been added to memorials for missing and murdered Indigenous children, ensuring that they would not be forgotten. The case had also inspired new research into the factors that contribute to child disappearances and the development of better strategies for prevention and response. Universities had established research programs dedicated to studying missing children cases, and new technologies were being developed to improve search and rescue operations. The story of Lilly and Jack Sullivan had become a cautionary tale about the importance of community vigilance, the need for effective social safety nets, and the devastating consequences when systems fail to protect vulnerable children. Their disappearance had exposed weaknesses in emergency response systems, child welfare protocols, and social support networks that had been addressed through policy reforms and increased funding. But perhaps most importantly, their story had served as a reminder that every child deserves protection, support, and the chance to grow up safe and loved. The failure to protect Lilly and Jack had been a collective failure, and their memory served as a call to action for everyone to do better. As the second anniversary of their disappearance approached, their case remained unsolved, but their legacy continued to grow. The reforms that had been implemented in their name had already helped to protect other children, and their memory continued to inspire efforts to strengthen the systems designed to keep all children safe. The voices of Lilly and Jack Sullivan had been silenced, but their story continued to speak to the need for vigilance, compassion, and action in protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Their legacy would be measured not just in the mystery of their disappearance, but in the positive changes that their story had inspired and the other children who would be protected because of the lessons learned from their tragic fate. In the end, the greatest tribute to Lilly and Jack Sullivan would be the prevention of similar tragedies through better systems, stronger communities, and unwavering commitment to protecting every child. Their memory would live on in the reforms that bore their names and in the countless acts of vigilance and care that their story had inspired. The case of Lilly and Jack Sullivan would likely remain unsolved, but their impact on society would continue to be felt for generations to come. They had become symbols of the need for constant vigilance in protecting children, and their memory would continue to inspire efforts to create a world where every child is safe, protected, and valued. Their story was a tragedy, but it was also a call to action. It was a reminder that the protection of children is everyone's responsibility, and that the failure to protect even one child is a failure that affects us all. The legacy of Lilly and Jack Sullivan would be measured not in the mystery of their disappearance, but in the commitment to ensure that their story would never be repeated. If you truly care about these missing children, click the subscribe button now, or at least tell us why you won't in the comment section.